The house was silent, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Emily sat alone on the couch, surrounded by photographs of a life she could no longer touch. The anniversary of John's death had arrived once again, marking 3 years since the car accident that had stolen him away. The day had come to mean little more than a painful reminder of her loss. She had tried to fill the void he left with distractions, but nothing seemed to work. Even now, the quiet was oppressive, a suffocating presence she couldn't escape. She absent-mindedly sifted through the old family photo album on the coffee table. John's smiling face stared back at her from every picture. Vacations, birthdays, ordinary days that now felt like a lifetime ago. Tears welled in her eyes as she traced the edges of a picture where they stood together, younger, happier. She missed him with a rawness that seemed to deepen with every passing year. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight. Emily glanced at it, wiping away a tear. She hadn't meant to stay up this late, but something about the date kept her awake. It was always like this, the weight of grief settling deeper into her chest with every anniversary, every memory she tried to forget. Suddenly, the silence broke. The phone on the coffee table rang, its shrill tone jarring in the stillness. Emily's heart skipped a beat. She glanced at the screen. Unknown caller. Her fingers froze above the phone for a moment. Was it a prank? Or perhaps it was just her mind playing tricks, a lingering echo of her sorrow. With a shaky breath, she picked it up, pressing it to her ear. Hello. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence on the other end. Then, a soft, trembling voice cut through the static. Emily, it's me? John. Her blood ran cold. The voice, though faint and distorted, was unmistakable. It was John's voice, the one she had loved, the one that had been absent from her life for 3 years. Her throat tightened as she tried to process what she was hearing. John, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Is it really you? The voice on the other end grew desperate. Please, help me. I'm trapped, Emily. I need you. Come, please. Her heart hammered in her chest as the words sank in. Trapped? What did that mean? How could this be happening? He was dead. She knew it. She had buried him with her own hands. This couldn't be real. The line went dead before she could say anything more. Emily stared at the phone, her hand trembling as she slowly lowered it. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just occurred. Was it a prank? A sick joke? Or something else? The voice had sounded so real, so full of emotion. A chill crept down her spine. Was it possible? No, it was impossible. There had to be an explanation. But deep down, Emily knew that the truth was far more terrifying than she could imagine. The phone call lingered in Emily's mind, replaying over and over in her thoughts. She sat there, staring at the phone in her hand, as though it might ring again at any moment, though deep down, she knew it wouldn't. It had been just a cruel trick, a distortion of her memories. But then why did it feel so real? Why had John's voice been so desperate? Shaking her head, Emily tried to push the thoughts away. It was late. Too late to make sense of any of it. She needed sleep, but the weight of what had just happened pressed heavily on her chest, making rest impossible. Her mind raced, darting between the logical and the irrational. The phone call couldn't be from John, but it had sounded so much like him. The same tone, the same warmth she had always loved. Grabbing her laptop from the coffee table, Emily began typing the number into a search engine, hoping to find some clue, some rational explanation. But nothing came up. It was an untraceable number. She tried again, typing the call's details, including the date and time, hoping to find something, a link to a company, or a service, or even a prankster. But no results. The number led nowhere, leaving her with more questions than answers. Her frustration grew. How could something so real, so personal, simply vanish? If this was some sort of joke, it had gone too far. She checked the phone again, convinced she was missing something, but it was just a regular call. Nothing unusual. Emily's gaze drifted toward the window. The full moon cast a cold, silvery light over the empty street, but the shadows felt heavier than usual, as if the night itself was watching her. Her skin prickled as though the air had suddenly turned colder, despite the warmth of the house. She grabbed her jacket and headed for the door. There was one place she hadn't thought to look: the cemetery, the place where John's body had been laid to rest. The thought of visiting the grave, especially at night, unsettled her, but something deep inside pushed her to go. With each step she took toward the car, Emily felt her heart rate quicken. The idea of visiting John's grave again, after all this time, made her stomach churn. What was she hoping to find? What could she possibly learn by going to that place in the middle of the night? But she knew she couldn't rest until she understood. The cemetery was only a few minutes away. But as she drove, the distance seemed to stretch on forever. Each turn in the road felt like it led her further into a nightmare. But Emily pressed on. She had to know if there was an answer, if there was some way to explain the unexplainable. The cemetery gates loomed ahead, their tall iron bars standing stark against the moonlit sky. Emily parked her car a little distance away, leaving the engine running for warmth. The cold night air bit at her as she walked through the entrance, the gravel crunching beneath her boots. Her breath fogged in the air, and the silence was suffocating. The faint whisper of the wind was the only sound, rustling the dry leaves scattered across the cemetery grounds. Emily shivered and pulled her jacket tighter, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. Every shadow seemed to move. Every rustle seemed to whisper her name. She paused at the first row of graves and glanced over the stones, searching for John's. It took a moment, but she found it. His name was carved into the cold stone, just as it had been on the day she buried him. But there was something different now, something beneath the surface. The cemetery was eerily quiet, the only sound coming from the faint rustling of trees in the distance. Emily stood in front of John's grave, staring at the cold stone, a chill creeping over her skin despite the warmth of her jacket. There was something wrong, something out of place here, but she couldn't pinpoint it. Her eyes traced the familiar engraving of John's name and the dates, birth and death. But now, it felt as though those dates marked the end of a chapter she couldn't close. As she knelt beside the grave, the air around her seemed to thicken. It was as if the world had quieted, leaving her alone in a silence so deep it felt unnatural. Her breath came out in short puffs, visible in the cold night air, as she gently reached out and touched the cool stone. "John," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know what's happening, but I need to understand." Her fingers lingered on the gravestone for a moment longer before she stood up, unable to shake the feeling that she was being watched. Her eyes flicked nervously around the cemetery, but there was no sign of anyone, just empty rows of graves stretching out before her. A sudden, sharp noise startled her, a sound of something brushing against the ground, like a whisper in the wind. Emily turned quickly, but there was nothing there, no movement, no footsteps, just the oppressive silence pressing down on her. Her pulse raced, and she took a step back, ready to leave. But before she could turn around, her phone rang again. She froze. The screen of her phone lit up, showing an unknown number. Her heart skipped a beat. "Not again," she whispered under her breath. But she couldn't ignore it. This time, there was no hesitation. She answered the call. "Hello." Her voice shook as she held the phone to her ear. "Emily." The voice on the other end was faint at first, distorted but unmistakable. "I'm still here. Please, you have to help me." It was John's voice again. This time, it was clearer, more urgent, more desperate. "I'm trapped, Emily. I can't leave. You have to come to me. Please." The words sent a cold shiver down her spine. Her fingers tightened around the phone as she stepped back, nearly stumbling on the uneven ground. "John, is this really you? How is this possible?" Her voice cracked, her throat tight as she struggled to comprehend what she was hearing. There was a pause, a heavy silence, and then the voice returned, more broken than before. "I'm in the graveyard, Emily. It's not just me. There's something else. I can't escape." The line went silent again, leaving Emily with only the sound of her own heartbeat hammering in her ears. She glanced around the dark cemetery, but the only thing she could see were the cold stone markers, the names etched into them like forgotten memories. The call abruptly ended, and Emily stood frozen for a moment, phone still pressed against her ear. The gravity of what she had just heard sank in. It couldn't be John. He was gone. But the voice The voice sounded like him, too much like him. How could that be possible? Her mind raced, trying to grasp at any logical explanation, but there was nothing. The only thing she could feel was a rising sense of dread, the same dread that had been building ever since the first call. Her eyes wandered back to John's grave, and the unease within her grew. What had he meant when he said, "There's something else"? As she stood in the cemetery, the world around her felt more suffocating, more hostile. A place of rest had turned into a prison, and somewhere, deep beneath the earth, something was waiting, calling to her. Emily didn't return to the cemetery that night. She couldn't bring herself to. The phone call had shaken her to her core. The voice, John's voice. There was no denying it had been him. But how? It didn't make sense. Nothing about this made sense. The following days passed in a blur. Emily tried to return to her normal routine, but it was impossible. Everywhere she went, she felt as though she was being watched, her mind constantly returning to that haunting voice. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that the call was only the beginning. It started with small things at first, things that were easy to ignore. She would walk into the living room and smell John's cologne, the one he wore every day. It was faint, like a memory, but it lingered in the air, just long enough to make her second-guess her own senses. Maybe it was just a trick of the mind, she told herself. But then the music started. It wasn't loud at first. In fact, it was barely audible, just the soft strains of John's favorite song drifting through the house. The tune, a slow jazz melody they'd always played on their first anniversary, began to fill the quiet space of the room where she sat, reading a book. Emily's heart skipped a beat. The song hadn't played in years, not since his death. And yet, here was again the soft, familiar notes floating through the air. She rushed to the stereo, but it was turned off. The record player hadn't been used in months. Emily's hands trembled as she fumbled with the buttons, turning the volume down until the song faded into nothingness. Her breath caught in her throat as she tried to steady herself. It was just her mind playing tricks again. She had to be imagining things. But then the shadows started. At night, when the lights were off, Emily would see them, just out corner of her eye, flickering in the dim glow of the streetlights outside. Shadows darting across the walls, figures too tall and thin to belong to anyone she knew. They didn't move like normal shadows. They twisted, they writhed, they almost seemed to watch her. But every time she turned to look, they vanished, leaving nothing but the emptiness of her room. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching her, waiting for something. She tried to tell herself it was just stress, just the result of too much time spent thinking about the phone call. But deep down, Emily knew it was more than that. Something in the house, something in the very air around her, felt wrong. It wasn't until she went to bed that night that it became undeniable. She awoke in the middle of the night to the sound of whispers, low and distant at first, but growing louder. Her heart raced as she listened to the soft murmur of voices, indistinct but full of emotion. The whispers circled around her, moving in and out of the room, like an invisible crowd gathering around her bed. "Emily," one of the voices said, and she froze. It was the same voice. It was John. "Emily?" The voice repeated, more urgent now, filled with desperation. The air in the room seemed to grow colder, and Emily's body tense in fear. She reached for the lamp beside her bed, her hand shaking as she switched it on. But as the light flickered to life, the whispers vanished, and the room was silent again. Her breath came in short gasps as she sat up, heart pounding in her chest. There was no one there, no one but her. But the lingering cold in the air and the echo of John's voice told her otherwise. Emily knew now, without a doubt, that this wasn't just a nightmare. Someone was trying to reach her. And it wasn't just John. It was something else, something darker that was feeding off her grief, growing stronger with every passing day. The next morning, Emily couldn't shake the lingering dread that had filled the room the night before. The whispers had felt too real, too close, and the coldness that had wrapped around her skin seemed to cling to her, following her throughout the day. She tried to go about her day, but nothing felt the same. The air in her apartment felt thick, heavy with the sensation of being watched. Every creak of the floorboards, every slight shift in the shadows seemed amplified. It was as if her house had transformed into a place she no longer recognized, a place haunted by something that wasn't just a memory of John. As much as she tried to brush it off as exhaustion or the weight of her grief catching up with her, deep down, she knew that the whispers, the shadows, the voice, it was all real. There was something in her home, something that she couldn't explain. And the worst part was, it seemed to be growing stronger with every passing moment. That night, Emily decided she had to do something. She couldn't keep ignoring the signs, couldn't pretend everything was fine when she knew it wasn't. She had to figure out what was going on. She needed answers. She returned to the cemetery, this time during the daylight hours. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the gravestones. It was peaceful, almost serene, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the ground beneath her feet was hiding something dark, something she wasn't supposed to know. John's grave was still where she had left it, the stone marker standing silent and still. But as she approached it, something caught her eye, something she hadn't noticed before. Just at the edge of the grave, half buried in the dirt, was a small, unmarked stone. It was cracked, chipped, and worn down by time, but there was something about it that drew her in. Her breath caught in her throat as she knelt beside it. She could feel the coldness of the stone against her fingers, a strange chill that made her skin prickle. The markings on the stone were barely visible, but as Emily wiped away the dirt, she made out the faint, jagged letters carved into it. Not alone. The words hit her like a physical blow. Not alone. What did that mean? Her mind raced, trying to make sense of it. But the answer eluded her. Was this some sort of warning? Or was it just a random stone, a piece of debris caught in the graveyard over time? But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that it was something more. She stood up, feeling her heart race in her chest as she looked around the cemetery. The air had grown heavy again, the shadows stretching longer than they should have been. She wasn't alone. Her gaze flickered to John's grave again, and for a moment, she could have sworn she saw a figure standing at the edge of it. A tall, shadowy figure, barely visible in the twilight. It was there for just a second, and then gone. Emily's stomach twisted into knots. She had to leave. The cemetery was no longer a place of remembrance. It was a place of something darker, something unknown. But as she turned to leave, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind her. She whirled around, but there was no one there. A voice, soft and distant, whispered through the still air. "Emily, help me." It was John's voice again. But this time, it didn't sound like him. It sounded wrong. It was distorted, broken, and something deeper, something darker was hidden beneath it. Emily ran, her heart pounding in her chest as she sprinted back to her car, her breath ragged and uneven. The weight of the voice, the presence she couldn't see, pressed down on her as she slammed the door of her car shut. She drove away from the cemetery, not daring to look back. But she knew that whatever it called to her from that graveyard wasn't just John. Something else was waiting for her, something much older, much darker, and it wasn't going to let her go. Emily didn't sleep that night. The events at the cemetery had shaken her to the core. She couldn't stop thinking about the mysterious stone, the cryptic message, "Not alone." She didn't understand its meaning, but she could feel its weight pressing on her, pulling her deeper into the mystery. And the voice, John's distorted voice, was still echoing in her mind, growing fainter but more insistent with every passing minute. By morning, the reality of what had happened began to set in. This wasn't just some weird coincidence or a trick of the mind. There was something in the cemetery, something attached to John's grave, something that had been waiting for her. And now that she had heard the call, it was like a door had opened and there was no way to close it again. Emily knew she needed answers. But where could she go to find them? The idea of consulting someone, anyone, about this seemed absurd. Who could she turn to? No one would believe her. And yet, she couldn't let it go. This wasn't just about John anymore. Something darker was lurking, something she didn't understand, and it wasn't going to rest until it was unleashed. After a long, sleepless day, Emily decided to do what she should have done from the start. She went to the library, to the archives section, determined to uncover anything she could about the cemetery, about the history of the land, and anything that might explain the strange happenings. The old librarian, a woman with sharp glasses perched on her nose and a voice that echoed in the empty halls, greeted Emily with a raised eyebrow. "You're here for the archives? It's all a bit, well, old. Are you sure you want to delve into that?" "I have to know," Emily replied, her voice unwavering, though inside her heart was pounding. The librarian nodded, understanding the determination in Emily's voice. "Well, if you insist," she said, leading her to a corner of the library where the dust-covered books and papers were stored. Emily scanned the rows of records, her fingers brushing across the old leather-bound volumes, until one caught her eye. It was a history book about the area, with a particular chapter dedicated to the cemetery. She opened it and began to read. The history of the cemetery was unsettling, to say the least. The land had originally been used for a different purpose, a place of rituals and ceremonies long before it was turned into a resting place of the dead. The book mentioned that the first grave was dug not for a person, but for something else entirely, a dark entity that had been trapped beneath the earth, sealed away by generations of settlers. As Emily read on, the story grew darker. The land had once been cursed, according to local legend, and those who dared disturb it would suffer the consequences. It seemed to imply that the ritual had never truly worked, that the entity remained buried, waiting for something or someone to call it back. Emily's hands trembled as she turned the page. Her eyes widened as she read about the strange occurrences that had plagued anyone who tried to visit the cemetery in recent years. Disembodied voices, shadows that moved on their own, and the feeling of being watched. The book hinted that the curse had only grown stronger with time, feeding off the grief of those who visited the graveyard. Not alone. The word from the stone rang in her ears. It wasn't just John. The curse had taken hold of him, too. She was being drawn into something that wasn't merely a tragic love story, but a much darker, ancient force. Terror gripped her as she closed the book. It wasn't a coincidence that John's voice had reached her. She had been called to the cemetery not just by grief, but by something far worse, something ancient. And now, it was too late to turn back. The library was eerily quiet as Emily closed the book, the words from the pages swirling in her mind like a storm. The history she had uncovered, the mention of a curse, and the dark entity buried beneath the cemetery, it all felt so surreal. She could hardly comprehend it. Yet the creeping sensation of something watching her only made it all the more real. She left the library in a daze, her mind racing with questions. What kind of curse had the settlers tried to seal away? And why had it chosen her, or rather, why had it reached out to her through John's grave? The feeling of dread pressed against her chest, suffocating her, but she had no choice but to confront it. She had to go back to the cemetery. She had to find answers. As she drove, the familiar street seemed unfamiliar, warped by her growing paranoia. The weight of the curse, of the unseen force that had begun to surround her, made every street lamp feel like an ominous eye staring down at her. When she finally arrived at the cemetery, it was just after dusk, the sky a deep shade of purple, the last traces of sunlight fading behind the horizon. The place looked different now, darker, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Emily's heart pounded as she walked toward John's grave, the cold wind biting at her skin. The cemetery seemed to be holding something back, as though it was trying to keep her from discovering the truth. But she couldn't stop now. She had already come this far. She knelt by the grave again, her fingers brushing over the stone, now familiar yet alien to her. She wasn't just here to mourn anymore. She was here to face the force that had been pulling her in, to face the ancient curse that had been unleashed. The air around her felt thick, heavy with an unseen presence. Emily glanced nervously around the graveyard, but she saw nothing. The only sound was the rustling of leaves, the whispers of the wind. But then, a chill ran down her spine. She heard it again, the faint, broken voice. "Emily?" She froze, her blood running cold. The voice was closer now, almost in her ear, but there was no one there. "Emily?" This time, it sounded different, more urgent, desperate. "John," she whispered, her voice shaking as she looked around frantically. But the graveyard was still empty. The shadows longer now, creeping toward her like fingers reaching from the ground. The voice didn't come again. Instead, a low, guttural sound vibrated through the air. It wasn't a whisper, but something much darker, something older. The earth beneath her feet seemed to tremble, as though something was shifting beneath the surface. And then she saw it, a figure, tall and shadowy, standing at the edge of John's grave, its outline flickering in and out of sight like a shadow caught between worlds. It was no longer just John she was feeling. The air around her was thick with the presence of something else, something ancient, something hungry. Her breath caught in her throat as the figure began to move, slow and deliberate, drawing closer to her. Emily stumbled backward, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind screaming at her to run. But her legs felt like lead, her body frozen in place as the shadow loomed closer, its form becoming clearer with every step. And then, in a voice that was not John's, but something deeper, older, the shadow spoke. "You're mine now, Emily," it whispered, the words curling around like a dark, suffocating fog. "You have awakened what you'd never been." The ground shook again, this time harder, and Emily fell to her knees, clutching the cold earth beneath her. The world around her seemed to spin, the shadows closing in, consuming her. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went quiet. The air was still, the figure gone, as if it had never been there at all. Emily sat in the graveyard, shaking, her heart still racing, her hands trembling. The weight of what she had just witnessed pressed down on her, suffocating her. She didn't know what to do, didn't know what was real anymore. But one thing was certain, the force, the curse, whatever it was now attached to her, and there was no escape. Emily couldn't breathe. The graveyard, the figure, the voice, it all replayed in her mind like a broken record, each moment more distorted than the last. She wasn't sure if she had hallucinated the shadow or if it was real. The fear, the overwhelming sense of being hunted, it felt real. The air around her still felt thick with that oppressive energy, like something unseen was watching her every move. She couldn't stay there. She had to leave. Emily scrambled to her feet, her hands still shaking, and stumbled toward her car. As she drove away from the cemetery, she kept her eyes straight ahead, refusing to look in the rear-view mirror. She was afraid that if she did, she might see the shadow standing in the distance, waiting for her to return. The drive back to her apartment was long and silent, the weight of what she had experienced pressing heavily on her chest. When she finally arrived, she rushed inside, locking the door behind her. But as she stood in the middle of the small living room, the sense of unease didn't go away. It followed her inside, like a dark cloud that refused to dissipate. She tried to shake it off. She had to focus, to think clearly. Her first instinct was to call someone, maybe a psychic or an expert on the supernatural, but she knew it was pointless. Who would believe her? The rational part of her, the part that had always been grounded in reality, wanted to dismiss it all as a dream, but she couldn't. She had seen the shadow. She had heard the voice. It was real. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden noise from the kitchen, a soft clinking sound, like something had fallen to the floor. Emily froze. She wasn't alone. Slowly, she walked toward the kitchen, her footsteps barely making a sound. The light flickered above her, casting long shadows on the walls. When she reached the doorframe, she hesitated. She didn't want to go in. She didn't want to face whatever was waiting for her there. But she had no choice. With a shaky breath, she stepped into the kitchen and immediately froze. On the floor, just by the refrigerator, was a small, broken piece of glass. It hadn't been there before. And more disturbingly, a strange symbol had been etched into the counter with what appeared to be dark, wet ink. The symbol was unfamiliar, but it was unsettlingly similar to something she had seen in the history book, the markings of ancient rituals. A chill ran down her spine as she realized the truth. The force, the entity, had followed her home, and it wasn't just lingering in the cemetery anymore. It had come with her. Her breath caught in her throat as she turned to face the living room. The shadows there seemed to shift and move, more alive than before. Something was drawing closer. "Emily," the voice again. But this time it was different. It wasn't just John. It was louder, more fragmented. There were other voices layered over his, faint whispers, indistinguishable sounds, all blending together in a chorus of desperation. "Emily, help us!" She didn't move. Her feet felt glued to the floor, the whispers of voices circling her, growing louder and more insistent. The temperature in the room dropped, and she could see her breath misting in front of her. Then, the shadows began to take shape. One by one, they materialized in the corners of the room, tall and thin, their outlines flickering like broken film. They weren't fully human, but their forms were familiar enough to make her heart race. Their eyes, if they could be called eyes, were black voids, empty and cold, staring straight at her. The shapes stretched and warped, their limbs too long, their movements too jerky, as though they weren't meant to exist in the same world she did. Emily could feel the weight of their gaze, their hunger pressing against her. "No!" she whispered, taking a step back. "This can't be happening." But the shadows didn't care. They advanced, inching closer with every breath she took. The whispers grew louder, more frantic. She could hear John's voice in the midst of them, his words indistinct but filled with sorrow. She couldn't make out what he was trying to say, but she knew one thing. He was no longer in control. The shadows were no longer just an illusion. They were real, and they had come to claim her. The shadows closed in around her, their elongated forms creeping toward her like dark tendrils, reaching out with an almost cruel deliberation. Emily's heart thudded violently in her chest, each beat amplifying the dread that filled her entire being. She couldn't move. Her body was frozen, locked in place by an unseen force, her mind screaming for her to run, to fight back, but her legs wouldn't respond. When the shadows inched closer, its face, or what passed for a face, appearing like a twisted mass of darkness. Emily could feel its presence, pressing against her, suffocating her with an overwhelming sense of hopelessness. The air around her thickened, and she could hear her own shallow breath mixing with the guttural whispers that echoed throughout the room. "Emily?" John's voice again, distorted, fractured, pained. But it wasn't just John now. It was a chorus of voices, all speaking at once, their tones pleading, demanding, suffocating. "Please." One voice rasped, its words barely audible over a cacophony of whispers. "Help us." Emily struggled to breathe as the figure in front of her reached out with impossibly long fingers, the tips brushing against her skin like icy needles. She flinched, the touch like a searing coal that burned through her flesh. Her vision blurred, and she felt herself sinking into a state of utter helplessness, the dark figure before her swallowing all the light in the room. She couldn't fight. She couldn't run. All she could do was watch as the shadows slowly surrounded her, their eyes, those empty, cold voids, fixed on her like predators waiting to strike. Suddenly, the room felt colder still, and the shadows seemed to pulse with a dark energy, like they were feeding off her fear. Her knees buckled, and she felt the floor gasping for air. The whispers seemed to intensify, every voice, every breath, a weight pressing down on her. The ground beneath her trembled, and a new presence filled the room, something far older, far more malevolent than the shadows themselves. Emily's breath hitched as a dark, pulsating form appeared before her. It wasn't like the others. This entity was massive, its shape shifting, as though it were made of smoke and shadows that constantly reformed. The temperature in the room plummeted as the creature drew closer, its malevolent energy suffocating her, seeping into her very bones. "No!" Emily gasped, her voice a mere whisper, barely audible over the growing noise. She tried to move, to escape, but her body felt paralyzed, weighed down by the crushing presence of the entity. It loomed over her, its form twisting and shifting in unnatural ways. Its eyes, a pair of glowing hollow orbs, locked on hers. The shadows around her began to shift, drawing closer, their whispers now rising to a deafening crescendo. The creature's massive form loomed over her, and a low, guttural voice resonated from within it. "You have disturbed us. You have awakened what was never meant to be." The words were not just spoken, they were felt. They vibrated through her chest, reverberating deep into her bones, sending waves of terror flooding through her body. The air thickened as the creature's presence pressed down on her, suffocating her from all sides. Emily's eyes widened in realization. She had come too close. She had stirred something that should never have been disturbed. The curse, the force that had been buried for centuries, was now awake, and it had found her. The shadows continued to gather, the voices growing louder, more desperate. John's voice was the most prominent, filled with sorrow and fear. She could hear him, calling her name, pleading for her help. But now it was clear. He was no longer the one in control. The shadows, the entity, they had claimed him, and they had claimed her too. Emily was no longer just in the presence of a curse. She was the curse's next victim, and there was no escape. The world around Emily had become nothing but a haze of shadows and whispers, the oppressive dark energy pressing in from all sides. She could no longer tell what was real and what was just her fear-driven imagination. Her thoughts were clouded, consumed by the voices and malevolent presence that hovered over her like a storm waiting to break. The cold, the dark, it all felt like it was closing in on her. But amidst the terror, a flicker of clarity sparked in her mind. John, her heart clenched. His voice, the pain in it, was so real. She could feel it, even though the shadows had swallowed him whole. But he was still there, somewhere, trapped within this curse, calling for her. She didn't know how or why, but she couldn't let go of him. Not like this. She had to find a way to save him. As the shadows circled closer, Emily's body trembling, the air thick with their oppressive energy, a deep, guttural voice pierced through the cacophony of whispers. The figure looming over her had finally spoken again, its tone mocking and final. "You cannot save him," it rasped. "He belongs to us now." "No." Emily's voice was raw but firm. "I won't let you have him." The figure tilted its head, a strange movement as its form seemed to ripple. Its dark, hollow eyes narrowed as if in amusement. "You think you have a choice? You are already ours." The shadows pressed in tighter, but Emily didn't flinch. She had come too far to turn back. This thing, whatever it was, had taken so much already. It had taken John, it had taken her peace, and it had taken her freedom. She couldn't let it take any more. "You're wrong," Emily whispered, a determination rising in her chest, shaking off the weight of fear. "I'm not like you." The ground trembled beneath her once more, but this time the vibrations were different. They weren't coming from the entity. They were coming from within her. A strange energy began to stir deep inside Emily, as if something within her had awakened, a force she hadn't realized she had. The shadows recoiled as if sensing the change, their form wavering, flickering in uncertainty. The presence in front of her seemed to falter. "Your power is weak, mortal," the creature snarled, its voice reverberating through the room, shaking the walls. Emily took a deep breath, her gaze locking onto the dark figure. "You're wrong," she repeated, her voice growing louder, stronger. "I'm not afraid of you." For the first time, she felt the weight of the curse loosening. She wasn't alone in this fight, not anymore. As if in response, her mind flashed to the history book she had read earlier. The words, the ritual, the entity trapped beneath the cemetery for centuries. It had been sealed, bound by those who had come before her. But the binding had been broken. It had been waiting for someone to set it free. And now, Emily had the power to stop it. She didn't know how, but the knowledge flooded her. This was her fight. She could still undo the curse. She could send the shadows back, lock the entity away again, and free John, but it would require a sacrifice. The whispers began to rise again, this time louder and more frantic. The shadows were closing in, wrapping around her, feeding off her fear. But Emily wasn't afraid anymore. She knew what she had to do. Her hand reached out toward the dark, the force swirling around her like a storm. The creature's hollow eyes widened, sensing the change. "You cannot defeat me," it hissed, its voice becoming a terrifying roar. "I am eternal. I was here before you, and I will remain after you are gone." "I don't need to defeat you," Emily said, her voice filled with the calm of someone who had made their peace. "I just need to send you back." In one swift motion, Emily closed her eyes and whispered the words that had come to her, the ancient incantation she had unknowingly discovered in the history book, words that had been spoken long ago to bind the curse. As she spoke them, the shadows began to writhe, their forms twisting violently, howling in fury. The energy around her grew intense, the temperature dropping to freezing levels. But she stood firm. I choose the light. I choose the end. There was a blinding flash of white light, and the shadows screamed. The air seemed to crackle with power as Emily's will collided with the force of the entity, fighting back against it. The dark figure lunged, but it was too late. The shadows began to dissolve, their forms disintegrating into nothingness, and the dark presence faltered. For a moment, everything was still. Then the room was filled with silence. The oppressive energy, the suffocating darkness, was gone. Emily opened her eyes. The shadows had disappeared. The air had cleared, and she could feel the weight lifting from her chest. She wasn't sure how, but she knew the curse had been lifted. The entity had been sealed away once more. John's voice, faint but clear, reached her ears. "Emily?" She turned, and there, standing just beyond the door, was John, his form flickering like a ghost. His eyes, once filled with sorrow, were now soft with gratitude. "You did it," he whispered. And though his form began to fade, Emily felt no fear. She had saved him. She had broken the curse. As John disappeared, a sense of peace washed over her. She wasn't alone anymore. The darkness had been defeated, and with it, the lingering fear. It was over. But Emily knew that the world was far more complex, far darker than she had ever imagined. The shadows might have retreated, but there would always be another battle, another force lurking in the dark. But for now, she was free. Emily sat on the edge of her bed, the room quiet now, the oppressive weight of the shadows gone. The air felt lighter, almost normal, but the stillness was unnerving. It wasn't peace. It was a fragile calm, a brief respite in the aftermath of storm. Her hands shook as she wiped her face, her mind still reeling from what had just happened. Had it been a dream? Had she truly witnessed it all? The dark figures, the entity, the voices? It seemed unreal now that the danger had passed, but the lingering memory of the horrors she had faced refused to fade. The symbols, the whispers, the darkness, they were seared into her mind forever. She glanced around the apartment, the dim light filtering through the windows, casting long shadows on the walls. For a moment, everything felt so ordinary, so calm, too calm. But Emily knew better. The world had changed. It wasn't just her imagination. The curse had been real. The darkness had been real. And she had fought it. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She froze. It was too late for anyone to be visiting. She wasn't expecting anyone. The knock came again, more insistent this time. With a hesitant breath, Emily stood and approached the door, her heart pounding in her chest. She glanced through the peephole, but saw nothing. A sudden chill ran down her spine, and a cold shiver shot through her limbs. Her mind screamed at her to turn away, to lock the door and never open again. But something inside her urged her forward. Slowly, she reached for the handle and pulled the door open. Nothing. No one stood there. But as she stepped out into the hallway, a sense of dread washed over her. The building was empty, silent. The air felt heavy again, as if the darkness hadn't truly left. She turned, glancing down the hallway, but there was no sign of anyone. Then, just as she was about to close the door, something caught her eye. A small, faint symbol had been etched into the wood of her doorframe, barely visible in the dim light. It was the same symbol she had seen in the kitchen, the one she had seen in the history book. Her breath caught in her throat. It's not over. The thought hit her like a punch to the stomach. No matter how much she wanted to believe it was over, no matter how much she wanted to leave the horrors behind, something inside her knew the truth. The darkness wasn't gone. It had only retreated. It had only bided its time. With shaking hands, Emily closed the door, but the weight of what she had just seen pressed down on her chest. She couldn't ignore it. She couldn't pretend that the curse had been broken for good. The entity might have been sealed away, but there would always be a trace of it, lingering in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to return. The finality of it all hit her. She wasn't done. Not yet. The door had opened, and with it, a new path had been revealed, a path that would lead her into even darker depths. And so, in that moment, she realized that this fight wasn't just about defeating the curse. It was about survival. She had survived the shadows, but they were still out there, lurking just beyond the veil. There would always be more to face. But Emily had learned something over the past weeks. She had learned that even in the face of unspeakable darkness, she could fight, and she would keep fighting. As long as the shadows remained, she would never stop,